Before we begin, if you find yourself wandering into the strange and unsettling corners of history, or in this case, the depths of a whispering forest, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales that blur the line between eerie and absurd. Tonight, we step into the first chapter of a story that might just make you reconsider your next woodland stroll. Chapter 1. The Whispering Trees. The forest had a name once, but no one remembers it now. Those who live near its edges call it simply the Old Wood, as if naming it properly might summon its attention. It isn't the kind of place you enter without reason. Hunters avoid it even when game is scarce. Children dare each other to touch its outermost trees, but never venture farther. The locals say the forest breathes, that its roots shift in the night, that its leaves murmur secrets in a language just beyond understanding. On the evening our story begins, a traveler named Elias found himself standing at the edge of that very wood. He was not a superstitious man, nor was he particularly foolish. Just desperate. A shortcut, he'd been told, could shave days off his journey to the next town. The alternative was a winding mountain pass haunted by bandits, and Elias had already lost enough coin to thieves. So, with a sigh and a muttered prayer to whatever gods might be listening, he stepped beneath the canopy. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the wrongness of it. The rustle of leaves was too precise, like fingers dragging across parchment. The wind didn't howl. It whispered syllables just shy of coherence. Elias told himself it was the trees creaking in the breeze, the natural settling of ancient wood. But then he heard the laughter. It was faint, distant, the kind of sound that might be mistaken for a trick of the ear. A child's giggle, light and airy, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. Elias froze. His hand went to the knife at his belt, though he couldn't say what he meant to do with it. The laughter came again, closer this time, and with it, a scent like damp earth and crushed petals. Something moved in the corner of his vision. A flicker of pale fabric between the trees, gone before he could turn his head. Elias swallowed hard. "Hello?" he called, cursing the tremor in his voice. The forest swallowed his words whole. No echo. No reply. Just that endless, whispering rustle. He took a step forward, then another. The path, if it could be called a path, was overgrown, roots knotted like grasping fingers. Shadows pooled in hollows where the moonlight couldn't reach. And then, abruptly, the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of something holding its breath. Elias had the distinct impression he was being watched. Not by one pair of eyes, but dozens. Unblinking, unseen, but disappearance. He turned slowly, scanning the trees. For a moment, nothing. Then, movement. A shape, slender and too tall, slipping behind an oak. A flash of something that might have been a face or might have been bark twisting into the suggestion of one. The stories came rushing back then. Old tales muttered over hearths, warnings disguised as folklore. Spirits of the wood, they said, older than the first stones laid by men. They didn't hate humans, exactly. They just found them interesting. Like a child finds a beetle interesting before pulling off its legs. Elias took a step back. A branch cracked underfoot, the sound impossibly loud. The whispering stopped. All at once, the forest went utterly still. And then, from somewhere above, a voice, soft, lilting, and unmistakably amused, said, "Lost, little one?" Elias didn't wait to hear more. He ran. Behind him, the trees sighed. The undergrowth shifted, and the hunt began. Chapter 2. The First Disappearance. The first recorded disappearance in the Old Wood was not, as one might expect, a tragic tale of a lost child or a doomed lover. No, the honor belonged to a man named Havelock the Unobservant, a shepherd with a singular talent for misplacing things, sheep, hats, his own shoes on clear afternoons. It was only a matter of time before he misplaced himself. Havelok's story begins, as so many foolish ventures do, with a bet. The year was 1372, and the local tavern had run out of ale, a tragedy that forced the patrons to entertain themselves in other ways. Someone suggested a wager, a silver coin to anyone who could retrieve a particular mushroom known to grow deep in the old wood. It was a deep, poisonous red, supposedly used in old rituals. Whether those rituals were medicinal, spiritual, or just an excuse for the village elders to hallucinate at festivals was unclear. Either way, Havelok, who had once eaten an entire wheel of moldy cheese on a dare, was the obvious volunteer. He set off at dawn, whistling, with all the caution of a man who had never once considered consequences. The villagers watched him go with the mixed emotions of people who knew they should feel guilty, but were too amused to stop him. Havelok's last words, shouted over his shoulder, were, "If I'm not back by supper, assume I found something better to do." He was not back by supper. At first, no one worried. Havelok was the sort of man who might wander into a neighboring village, forget why he was there, and take up temporary employment as a scarecrow. But when 3 days passed without sign of him, a search party was reluctantly organized. Reluctantly, because no one wanted to enter the old wood, and also because Havelok was not, strictly speaking, a great loss to the community. The searchers found his hat perched neatly on a stump, as if placed there by careful hands. His flask lay beside it, empty, though Havelok had sworn it was full when he left. The strangest detail, however, was the mushrooms. A ring of them, that same deep red, circled the stump in perfect formation. They had not been there when Havelok entered the forest. Mushrooms do not grow that fast, at least not normally. The villagers took the hat and the flask back to the tavern, where they debated the meaning of these clues with the solemn gravity of men who had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. The blacksmith insisted it was bandits. The miller's wife swore it was witchcraft. The baker, who had once been bitten by a suspiciously intelligent fox, muttered something about the fair folk and refused to elaborate. Then, a week later, the hat disappeared from the tavern. No one saw it go. It was there at closing time and gone by morning. The flask vanished the next night. The villagers, being practical folk, took the hint and stopped asking questions. A small shrine was erected at the forest's edge, a token gesture to appease whatever had taken Havelok. It consisted mostly of old shoes, he was always losing them after all, and occasional offerings of ale. Whether this pleased the forest spirits or simply confused them, no one could say. But every so often, on quiet nights when the wind was just wrong, the villagers swore they could hear whistling from deep in the trees. A familiar, off-key tune drifting between the branches. Havelok, it seemed, had found something better to do. And the forest, having acquired a taste for human folly, waited patiently for the next volunteer. It would not have to wait long. Chapter 3. The Woodcutter's Talon. Of all the professions least suited to surviving the old wood, woodcutting should have been near the top of the list. Yet, somehow, this fact escaped Gregor the Unyielding, a man whose confidence in his axe was matched only by his staggering inability to recognize impending doom. Gregor had spent 20 years felling trees in the safer, more boring forests to the south, where the worst thing that ever happened was accidentally splitting a beehive. He had heard the stories about the old wood, of course. Everyone had. But he dismissed them with the same effortless arrogance he applied to weather forecasts, warnings about overeating, and his wife's increasingly pointed suggestions that he might want to stop talking for 5 minutes. The problem with people, he declared to the villagers one evening, wiping ale foam from his beard, is that they let their imaginations run wild. Trees are trees. Spirits? Ha! You know what cuts through spirits? A sharp blade and a sharper mind? The villagers exchanged glances. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, though there were no dogs in the village. Unterteret, Gregor announced his plan to single-handedly tame the old wood by chopping down its largest oak an ancient, gnarled thing rumored to be the heart of the forest's mischief. The villagers, torn between morbid curiosity and the faint hope that maybe this would finally shut him up, watched him march off at dawn with his axe slung over his shoulder, like a man headed to a particularly straightforward execution. The first sign that things were not going according to plan came when Gregor's singing abruptly stopped. He had been belting out a lumberjack's ballad, badly, when the forest swallowed the sound whole, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The second sign was the axe marks. Gregor had in fact found the great oak. He had even managed to sink his blade into it once. The cut was clean, precise, the work of a skilled hand. But the next swing never came. Instead, the villagers who later investigated found the axe embedded in the tree at an impossible angle, as if the wood had twisted mid-strike to trap it. Gregor's gloves lay on the ground, fingers still curled around an invisible handle. His coat hung from a branch, neatly folded. But the real curiosity was the note. Scratched into the bark of the oak, in what might have been knife point or claw, was a single sentence. "Hey, talks too much. We'll keep him a while." For a time, the villagers debated what this meant. Was Gregor dead? Kidnapped? Had the spirits simply gotten tired of his monologues and decided to teach him the virtues of silence? Then, 3 nights later, the answers started arriving. It began with the dreams. Nearly everyone in the village dreamed of Gregor that week. In some dreams he was tied to a mushroom circle, forced to listen to endless whispering. In others, he was suspended from the oak's branches, like a particularly unlucky Christmas ornament. The butcher's daughter swore she saw him in her mirror, mouth moving soundlessly, eyes wide with panic. Most unsettling of all, though, was the laughter. Not the high, airy giggles of before, but deep, booming chuckles that rattled windows and made dogs hide under beds. It came from the forest, always at dusk, and it had a distinctly Gregor-like cadence. If Gregor had been possessed by something that found human suffering hilarious, the villagers, being sensible folk, took the hint. No more bets. No more dares. Certainly no more attempts at deforestation. They left offerings at the shrine, mostly bottles of strong liquor, in case the spirits had inherited Gregor's thirst, and tried very hard not to think about what a while might mean to something that didn't measure time in human years. As for Gregor, well, if you stand very still at the edge of the old wood on a quiet evening, you might hear it. The faint, rhythmic sound of an axe striking wood. Slow, gentle, steady, pitch lines, never stopping. And if you listen long enough, you might just catch the whisper that follows it, floating between the trees like a half-remembered joke. Zay, I told you I could tame it. Chapter 4. The Scholar's Folly. There are few things more dangerous than a man who believes himself immune to danger, and fewer still more insufferable than a scholar who believes himself immune to superstition. Enter Albrecht of Westmore, a man whose education was both extensive and, unfortunately for him, entirely theoretical. Albrecht arrived in the village on a crisp autumn morning, his saddlebags stuffed with books, his expression radiating the quiet smugness of someone who had never once been proven wrong. He was a man of letters, a chronicler of natural philosophy, and most importantly, a skeptic. The villagers' tales of disappearing shepherds and overly chatty woodcutters struck him as the sort of nonsense that persisted only because peasants lacked the intellectual rigor to dismiss them. "Fascinating," he murmured, scribbling notes as the blacksmith recounted Havelock's mushroom-related misadventure. "And you're quite certain none of you simply forgot where you buried him?" The blacksmith, who had once thrown a man through a window for less, merely cracked his knuckles and suggested Albrecht take his inquiries directly to the forest. And so he did. Albrecht's plan was simple. He would spend a single night in the old wood, document its flora and fauna, and emerge at dawn with empirical proof that the locals' fears were unfounded. He brought a lantern, a compass, a journal, and, because he was not a complete fool, a small silver bell, the kind meant to ward off ill spirits. Poorly for cultural study, of course. He didn't believe in it, obviously. The first hour passed without incident. The trees were old, yes, and oddly shaped, but trees often were. The rustling in the undergrowth was clearly a fox. The faint, echoing whispers, just the wind. Probably. Then the compass stopped working. Albrecht frowned at the spinning needle, tapped the glass, and muttered something unscholarly under his breath. He consulted his star chart next, only to find the constellations had shifted in ways that defied astronomy. The North Star was southwest. That wasn't possible. Unless he was wrong, which he wasn't. Ever. He took a step forward, or at least he meant to. His foot came down on a patch of moss that hadn't been there a moment ago. The lantern flickered. Shadows stretched in directions light wasn't supposed to bend. Ridiculous, Albrecht announced to no one. This is simply a mild disorientation caused by. The bell rang. Not from his pocket. From somewhere ahead, deep in the trees. A clear, bright chime, as if someone or something had taken an identical bell and shaken it gently, mockingly. Albrecht's hand flew to his own bell. Still there. Silent. He took a step back. The path he'd come down was gone, replaced by a wall of brambles that definitely hadn't been there before. He turned again. The trees had closed ranks behind him, their roots knitting together like clasped hands. "No, see here," he said, addressing the forest with the tone of a man correcting a misbehaving student. "This is childish. If you're attempting to frighten me, I assure you it won't." Something giggled. Not a fox. Not the wind. A giggle. High-pitched, close, and utterly human, except for the way it seemed to come from inside his own skull. Albrecht's journal fell from his hands. The pages fluttered open, revealing notes that were no longer in his handwriting. Neat, looping script filled the margins, repeating a single phrase in increasingly frantic loops. "Look! Behind you! Look behind you! Look behind you! Look behind you!" He didn't. Instead, he ran. Branches snagged his coat. Roads twisted underfoot. The lantern's light shrank to a pinprick, then winked out entirely. He could hear them now. Whispers, laughter, the occasional chime of that damned bell, always just ahead, just behind, never where he could see. Dawn, when it came, found the villagers gathered at the forest's edge. They hadn't expected Albrecht to return, but there he was, staggering from the trees, wild-eyed and babbling. His coat was inside out. His hair had turned white, and clutched in his shaking hands was his journal. Every page crammed edge to edge with the same 3 words, written over and over in a manic, spidery scrawl. They were right. Shema, ye. The villagers, being practical folk, gave him warm broth, a blanket, and a wide berth. Albrecht never spoke of that night again, though sometimes, when the wind was wrong, he would flinch at the sound of distant laughter. As for the journal, the village children found it years later in the attic of the old inn. They used it to press wildflowers, unaware that if you turned the pages just right, the ink shifted under the light, forming faces in the margins, all of them smiling. The moral of this story, of course, is that academia is no match for spiteful spirits. And also always bring a bigger bell. Chapter 5. The Village's Denial. The human mind has a remarkable capacity for denial, particularly when faced with the impossible. The villagers at the edge of the old wood were no exception. In fact, they had elevated denial to an art form, weaving increasingly elaborate explanations for the disappearances, each more absurd than the last. The first theory, proposed by the blacksmith's wife, was that Havelock had simply run off with a traveling merchant's daughter. This was unlikely, given that Havelock had once mistaken a scarecrow for a potential romantic partner, but the villagers latched onto it with desperate enthusiasm. They even claimed to spot him in neighboring towns, though these sightings suspiciously coincided with market days when ale was plentiful and memories unreliable. Gregor the woodcutter's vanishing proved harder to explain away. The baker, a man who believed all of life's problems could be traced to improper kneading techniques, insisted Gregor had been carried off by a freak whirlwind. Never mind that the weather had been perfectly calm that day, or that whirlwinds rarely stopped to fold a man's coat. The villagers nodded along, grateful for any excuse not to mention the axe still lodged in the oak. By the time Albrecht the scholar stumbled back into town, half mad and covered in leaves, the theories had reached new heights of creative nonsense. The miller, a man who distrusted anything he couldn't grind into flour, declared that the forest was infested with unusually large owls. "They swoop down, carry people off," he explained gravely. "Silent they are, deadly." This prompted a heated debate about whether owls could, in fact, lift a full-grown man. The blacksmith, who had once seen a hawk carry off a rabbit, argued it was theoretically possible. The innkeeper countered that if owls were stealing people, they would at least leave behind bones, wouldn't they? The conversation devolved into a 3-hour argument about bird anatomy, before someone pointed out that none of this explained the giggling. The village elders, sensing that their authority was being undermined by ornithology, convened an emergency meeting in the tavern. After several rounds of ale and a regrettable incident involving the butcher and a poorly secured sausage, they arrived at their official verdict: mass hysteria. The disappearances were all in everyone's heads, they declared, the result of bad air drifting from the marshes. This was met with immediate skepticism, given that the nearest marsh was 5 miles away and smelled primarily of ducks. Still, the elders stood firm. To prove their point, they organized a village-wide rationality festival, featuring such enlightening activities as staring at the forest until it looks normal again, and listing all the things that definitely aren't spirits. It was during this festival that the next disappearance occurred. Old Thomas, the village's part-time gravedier and full-time drunk, had volunteered to guard the festival bonfire, a task that mostly involved preventing children from setting themselves aflame and occasionally poking the fire with a stick. No one noticed when he wandered toward the tree line, muttering about getting a better look at those damn owls. They did, however, notice when his shovel came flying out of the darkness and embedded itself in the bonfire's center post. The villagers stared. The shovel trembled slightly, as if something were still holding the other end. Then, with a slow, deliberate tug, it was yanked back into the shadows. A beat of silence passed. The blacksmith's wife cleared her throat. "Well," she said brightly, "that was obviously a very strong owl." The Rationality Festival ended early that night. Over the next few weeks, the theories grew wilder. The cobbler swore it was underground rivers swallowing people whole. The weaver's apprentice blamed invisible badgers. The innkeeper, after one too many ales, suggested the missing had simply evaporated out of shame for living in such a superstitious village, a comment that earned him a punch to the nose and a temporary ban from his own establishment. The only person who didn't contribute to the speculation was young Elsa, the miller's daughter. She simply sat by the window, knitting tiny woolen mushrooms and humming a tune that none of the villagers recognized, but that the forest seemed to echo back, note for note. The villagers, being sensible folk, chose not to dwell on that. After all, denial is a far more comfortable companion than truth. And if the truth happened to be watching them from the trees, well, at least it had the decency to laugh quietly. Chapter 6. The Hunter's Trap. There came a point when even the most stubborn villager had to admit the disappearances weren't stopping, But for Yorick the hunter, this wasn't a warning. It was a challenge. Yorick was a man who had once wrestled a bear and walked away with nothing worse than a bruised ego and a new fur hat, which technically the bear had been wearing at the time. He tracked game by scent alone, could shoot a hair through the eye at 100 paces, and had never once in his life encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with the careful application of sharp objects. The forest spirits, in his professional opinion, were either overgrown foxes in need of skinning, or, more likely, complete nonsense made up by people who didn't know how to hold a knife properly. His plan was simple: bait and trap. He spent 3 days preparing. The bait was a freshly killed deer, its belly slit open and stuffed with mushrooms stolen from old Thomas's secret stash. The trap was a masterpiece of ropes, concealed pits, and no fewer than 6 iron bear traps polished to a gleam. Yorick even added a few decorative touches. Silver bells hung from the trees, church blessed charms nailed to every third trunk, and a large painted sign that read "Are ye spirits, keep outie," in what he considered a very persuasive font. As he worked, the forest watched. Branches creaked in ways branches shouldn't. Shadows pooled a little too thickly around his traps. Once he turned to find his footprints had disappeared behind him, the moss unbroken as if he'd floated to his current position. Yorick dismissed this as tricky morning light and kept working. On the 4th night he settled into his hiding spot, a cleverly disguised blind just uphill from the bait, and waited. The first hour passed quietly. Then the bells rang. Not the careful, testing jingle of an animal brushing past. This was a cacophony, every bell pealing at once as if struck by invisible hands. The ropes of Yorick's traps whipped upward into the darkness, coils slithering through the leaves like startled snakes. The bear traps snapped shut one by one in perfect sequence, their iron teeth biting nothing but air. Yorick, to his credit, didn't panic. He knocked an arrow, iron-tipped, carved with protective runes he didn't believe in but had copied from Albrecht's journal anyway, and peered into the gloom. The deer was gone. Not dragged away. Not eaten. Gun day duknisse uzame figana busikudar sibnana. The space where it had lain was empty, except for a neat circle of red mushrooms, still glistening with what might have been dew or might have been something else entirely. A whisper drifted from the trees. "Hunt better." Yorick spun, releasing the arrow on instinct. It struck a birch trunk with a hollow "bithoke." Except when he blinked, the arrow wasn't embedded in wood at all. It was clutched in a pale, spindly hand that hadn't been there a second ago. The hand flexed. The arrow splintered like dry kindling. That was when Yorick decided tactical retreat was an advanced hunting technique, not cowardice. He ran. His carefully marked trail had vanished. The trees seemed to lean in as he passed, branches snagging at his clothes like beggars' fingers. Behind him, the traps continued to trigger in mocking succession. Pits collapsing, snares whipping shut, each sound punctuated by that same giggling whisper. Dawn found him at the village gate, bootless, wide-eyed, and clutching the remnants of his fur hat, now chewed to ragged scraps, with teeth marks that looked suspiciously human. The villagers took one look at him and immediately launched into fresh theories. Wolves, obviously, or maybe very ambitious squirrels. Yorick didn't correct them. But that night, as the village slept, something heavy and unseen dragged his carefully disarmed traps back into the forest. And if the next hunter to pass the old wood happened to notice fresh tracks, footprints alternating with something that might have been hooves or might have been hands, well, some lessons only need teaching once. Chapter 7. The Child Who Returned. The villagers had long since accepted that people who entered the old wood did not come back. So when 12-year-old Lisa wandered out of the trees one autumn morning, her hair braided with blackberry vines, and her eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear, the entire village forgot how to breathe. She had been missing for 3 weeks. Her parents, who had already burned her bedding in a futile attempt to ward off bad luck, nearly fainted when she appeared at their doorstep, holding a basket of mushrooms that hadn't grown in living memory. The mushrooms pulsed faintly in the dawn light, their caps opening and closing like tiny mouths. Lisa set the basket on the table with the quiet precision of someone arranging bones in a reliquary. "You're back," her mother whispered, which was both obvious and the only thing she could think to say. Lisa tilted her head. "Am I?" This unsettling response was promptly ignored as the village erupted into celebration. There was feasting, there was singing, there was a great deal of ale consumed while carefully not looking at the basket of possibly sentient mushrooms. The blacksmith's wife declared it a miracle. The miller swore he'd always believed in happy endings. The baker, who had spent the past 3 weeks insisting lies had been carried off by exceptionally polite bandits, got drunk enough to admit he might have been wrong about 1 or 2 details. Only old Thomas, who had seen more of life than most and remembered more of it than anyone preferred, noticed how Lise never quite stepped into sunlight, or how the shadows in the room leaned toward her when she moved. "What happened in there, girl?" he asked when the others had staggered off to bed. Lisa considered the question with the detached interest of a scholar examining a pinned beetle. "They wanted to play," she said at last. Thomas's liver-spotted hands trembled around his tankard. "And did you?" "Oh, yes." A smile flickered across her face, there and gone like a minnow in dark water. "We played hide-and-seek first, but I kept winning, so they changed the rules." The next morning, the villagers discovered 2 things. First, that every mushroom in the basket had vanished overnight, leaving behind a fine red powder that smelled like rain on old blood. Second, that Lisa's reflection in the mill pond didn't quite match her movements. When she raised her left hand, the reflection raised its right. When she blinked, the reflection's eyes stayed open a heartbeat too long. These details were, of course, dismissed as morning fatigue and poor lighting. But as the days passed, more inconsistencies emerged. Lisa no longer ate, though she sometimes left offerings of milk and honey at the forest's edge. She hummed melodies no one recognized, tunes that made dogs howl and infants wake screaming. Once the schoolmaster swore he saw her shadow detach itself and scuttle up the wall like a spider, though he blamed this vision on bad cheese. The village, being practical folk, chose to focus on happier matters. Lisa was back. Alive. Mostly unharmed. Never mind the way birds fell silent when she passed, or how the braids in her hair never loosened, not even in the fiercest wind. These were small oddities, easily ignored, until the night of the harvest festival. The bonfire was high, the ale was flowing, and the villagers were drunk enough to temporarily forget their unease when Lise stepped into the firelight holding a wooden flute that hadn't been there a moment before. "Would you like to hear a song?" she asked. Before anyone could answer, she began to play. The melody slithered into ears and curled behind eyes. It tasted of rotting leaves and sweet, spoiled fruit. Some villagers swayed. Some wept. Old Thomas clamped his hands over his ears and screamed, but no one heard him over the music. When the song ended, Lise lowered the flute and smiled at her audience with all the warmth of a winter river. "They want you to know," she said softly, "that the game isn't over." The next morning, 5 villagers were missing. Their beds were empty, their doors still locked from the inside. The only clue was a single blackberry vine coiled on each threshold, its thorns glistening with something that might have been dew. Lise was gone too. But if you stand very still at the forest's edge on a windless night, you might hear it, the distant piping notes of a flute, beckoning. And if you're very foolish, you might even follow. Chapter 8. The Priest's Exorcism. Father Anselm arrived in the village on a donkey so old it might have predated the forest itself, his vestments neatly pressed, and his expression radiating the serene confidence of a man who had never once had his faith properly tested. The bishop had sent him specifically, citing his unshakable resolve and impressive lung capacity. qualities that would, theoretically, serve him well against supernatural foes. The villagers, who had by now exhausted every possible non-spiritual explanation for the disappearances, including but not limited to elaborate pranks, mass amnesia, and an undocumented breed of very theatrical wolves, welcomed him with the desperation of drowning men clutching at a sermon. Anselm surveyed the forest edge with the practiced eye of someone who had banished demons from 3 whole parishes, all of which had later been revealed to be suffering from mold-induced hallucinations, but that hardly mattered now. "This," he announced, "is clearly a case of demonic infestation." The blacksmith coughed. "We've been calling them spirits." "Semantics." Anselm waved a hand. "The solution is the same. Holy water, Latin, and a great deal of shouting." He set to work immediately. The perimeter was marked with blessed salt. The trees nearest the village were draped with so many rosaries they looked like particularly devout Christmas ornaments. Anselm himself spent an entire afternoon rehearsing his exorcism rites, pausing only to correct the villagers' pronunciation of exorcismus te, omnis immundus spiritus, and to eat an alarming quantity of communion wafers. The grand cleansing was scheduled for noon on Sunday, when divine power was said to peak. The entire village gathered to watch, packed together like sheep in a storm. Anselm, resplendent in his stole, and carrying a crucifix so large it bordered on impractical, raised his arms to the sky and began the rite. His voice boomed across the clearing. The Latin rolled off his tongue like celestial thunder. The holy water arced through the air in perfect, glittering droplets. For a moment it almost seemed to be working. Then the forest giggled. It started as a whisper, then rose into full-blown laughter, high, breathless, and unmistakably mocking. The holy water sizzled where it struck the ground, but not in the way Anselm had hoped. Instead of driving back evil, it seemed to be absorbed with what could only be described as relish. Tiny, steaming mushrooms sprouted in each damp spot, their caps quivering with amusement. Anselm faltered. He raised his voice higher. The laughter grew louder. A particularly bold gust of wind sent his stole flapping into his face. The crucifix grew inexplicably heavy, then hot, until Anselm was forced to drop it with a yelp. It landed in the dirt with a thud, and then stood itself upright, upside down. The villagers gasped. Anselm, never one to admit defeat, switched tactics. He produced a vial of oil allegedly blessed by the Pope himself, and began tracing the sign of the cross on every tree within reach. The oil gleamed for a moment before the bark absorbed it, leaving behind faint, smirking faces that winked out one by one. "Enough!" Anselm roared. He drew a knife, ceremonial, silver, and until this moment purely decorative, and stabbed it into the nearest oak. The forest went silent. Then the knife melted. Not from heat. It simply flowed. The metal turning liquid and slipping between Anselm's fingers like quicksilver before pooling into a perfect grinning mouth at the base of the tree. "Oops," the mouth said. Anselm paled. What followed was less a holy rite and more a negotiation, though the terms were decidedly one-sided. The forest, through various rustles, creaks, and the occasional disembodied voice, made its position clear. It was older than the church, older than Latin, and vastly more entertained by this performance than it had any right to be. Anselm's resolve crumbled faster than a sinner at confession. By dusk he was packed and halfway to the next town, muttering something about needing reinforcements and possibly a different vocation. The villagers watched him go with the weary resignation of people who had known exactly how this would end. That night, as the moon rose, the forest exhaled. The rosaries tinkled like wind chimes. The salt lines shifted into spirals and arrows, as if marking paths. And from deep in the trees came the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, practicing Latin verbs with exaggerated solemnity. The villagers, being practical folk, took the hint. They stopped calling the things in the wood spirits, demons, or anything else that might invite further theological debate. Some words, they decided, were better left unspoken. And if the occasional hymn book was later found with its pages stuck together with blackberry juice, or if the church bell sometimes rang itself in the dead of night, well, some battles weren't worth fighting twice. Chapter 9. The Merchant's Bargain. Of all the terrible ideas to take root in the shadow of the old wood, none blossomed with such spectacular folly as the plan hatched by Aldrich the merchant, a man whose greed was matched only by his staggering lack of self-preservation. Aldrich arrived in the village not as a pilgrim or refugee, but as an entrepreneur. He'd heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? But where others saw danger, he saw opportunity. "Do you realize what you're sitting on?" he demanded of the innkeeper, slapping a damp palm on the bar. "A gold mine. Not literal gold, of course, though who knows, real. But the tourism potential." The villagers stared. "Think about it," Aldrich continued, undeterred. "Haunted forest doors. Spirit sighting guarantees. I'll sell protective charms, overpriced mushrooms labeled authentic, cursed, maybe even bottled whispers from the trees." The blacksmith interrupted by slamming a tankard down hard enough to crack the wood. "You'll die." Aldrich waved this away. "Risk is part of business. Besides, I don't plan to go in myself. I'll hire local guides." This was how Aldrich found himself standing at the forest's edge the next morning with Thomas, who had been bribed with a bottle of something potent, and a wagon full of merchandise ranging from questionable to outright fraudulent. The protective charms were repurposed horse brasses. The cursed mushrooms were just common puffballs, dyed red. The bottled whispers were, as far as anyone could tell, Aldrich humming into empty wine bottles. "Right then," Aldrich said, rubbing his hands together. "Let's harvest some supernatural ambience." The first sign of trouble came when the wagon's wheels sank into the earth up to the axles, despite the ground being perfectly firm a moment before. The second sign came when the price tags on all the merchandise flipped themselves upside down, the numbers rearranging into symbols no one recognized. Thomas, who had seen enough to know when to leave, took one look at the shuddering trees and vanished with his bottle. Aldrich, being Aldrich, pressed on. He hammered a sign into the nearest tree. "Haunted souvenirs. 50% off if you survive," and began setting up shop. The forest watched. By midday, Aldrich had sold exactly 3 charms to no one in particular. The coins left in his lockbox turned out to be dead leaves by sunset. He was just considering packing it in when his first real customer appeared. She was tall, very tall, and pale, and possibly not entirely solid around the edges. "Huh?" Aldrich beamed. "A connoisseur of the macabre. Might I interest you in?" The spirit, for it could be nothing else, leaned over his wares with unsettling curiosity. Its fingers, too long by half, trailed over the bottles of whispers. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind through hollow bones. "You trade in stolen things." Aldrich blinked. "I prefer to think of it as redistributed ambience." The spirit made a noise like a dozen beetles scurrying over parchment. It might have been laughter. It picked up one of Aldrich's fake charms, studied it, then dropped it into its mouth and swallowed. Aldrich's smile faltered. Then the bargaining began. The spirit wanted everything. Not to buy, to trade. It offered acorns that sprouted into miniature screaming trees. It offered vials of what looked like liquid shadow. It offered a handful of teeth that kept rearranging themselves into different smiles. Aldrich, ever the businessman, tried to negotiate. "Now for the premium cursed experience, I really must insist on—" The forest inhaled. When Aldrich stumbled back into the village that evening, he was alone. His wagon was gone. His clothes had been turned inside out and stitched back together with blackberry thorns. His pockets were full of acorns that sobbed quietly when shaken. But the real surprise came when he opened his money pouch. Instead of coins, it spilled over with perfect white teeth, each one etched with tiny, grinning faces. The villagers, being practical folk, gave him wide berth. Aldrich himself never spoke of what happened in the forest, though he did develop a sudden aversion to profit margins. His new shop, a modest stall selling plain wooden toys, strangely never turned a profit, though children swore the dolls whispered to them at night. As for the original merchandise, well, if you walk the forest paths at dusk you might spot them. A horse brass nailed to a birch tree, a red-painted mushroom displayed like a trophy on a stump. And if you listen very carefully, you might just hear the spirits conducting their own transactions, their voices rising and falling in perfect imitation of Aldrich's sales pitch. One scream for two shadows. Final offer. Chapter 10. The Lover's Pact. There comes a time in every cursed forest's history when two young lovers decide to defy the obvious warnings, and Edric and Mila were nothing if not traditional. He was the miller's son with more courage than sense. She was the weaver's daughter with a laugh like silver bells and a habit of collecting things that probably shouldn't be touched. Mushrooms with faces, stones that wept, the occasional prophetic dream. They were, in short, perfect victims. Their plan was simple: prove the forest harmless by spending one night in its heart and return as heroes. Or failing that, elope to the next town where people had better things to fear than trees. "We'll take the old path," Edric said, tracing a route on a map he'd drawn based entirely on tavern tales and guesswork. Straight to the clearing with the lightning-struck oak, then back by dawn. Mila, who had once convinced an entire market square that her pet crow was a bishop in disguise, kissed his cheek. "And if we meet any spirits, we'll invite them to the wedding." They set out at twilight, armed with bread, cheese, a flask of brandy that had been blessed by at least 2 religions, and a truly staggering amount of optimism. The villagers, who by now recognized the particular glint of doomed romance in young eyes, watched them go with the resigned horror of people who would shortly need to organize another search party. The first hour passed pleasantly enough. Fireflies danced in patterns just a little too synchronized to be natural. The path remained stubbornly visible, though it occasionally looped back on itself when they weren't looking. Mila pocketed a handful of acorns that shivered when touched and a single white feather that refused to be left behind. Then the whispering started. Not the usual forest murmur, but words, clear, coaxing, and coming from 3 directions at once. "Turn back," sighed the leaves. "Stay a while," creaked the branches. "Pretty things," giggled the shadows between the roots. Edric tightened his grip on Mila's hand. "Just wind," he lied smoothly. Mila, who had stopped believing in coincidences around the time her crow started quoting scripture, nodded too quickly. Obviously. They reached the lightning oak as midnight approached. It was exactly as described, charred, twisted, and radiating the distinct impression it was leaning closer to hear them better. Edric, ever the romantic, produced a knife to carve their initials into the bark. The tree bled, not sap, dark, thick liquid that smelled like wet earth and old copper. The initials, AM, stayed carved, but by morning light they would appear reversed, as if viewed through a mirror. Mila, to her credit, didn't scream. That's new. Edric, to his detriment, didn't run. Probably just. The brandy flask exploded. Not from heat. It simply burst like overripe fruit, showering them with liquid that turned to mist before hitting the ground. The bread moldered in seconds. The cheese developed eyes, actual blinking eyes, and began weeping softly. That was when the lovers finally agreed it might be time to leave. The path home had vanished. They walked anyway, counting steps, marking trees with torn fabric, doing all the sensible things people do right before ceasing to be sensible. The forest shifted around them. Trees they'd passed hours ago reappeared ahead. Stars reflected in puddles that shouldn't have existed showed constellations no one recognized. And then, the offer. It came from a voice that wasn't there, spoken directly into their minds like a shared nightmare. One stays, one goes. Choose. Edric and Mila exchanged glances. The unspoken words hung between them. This was how the forest worked. It loved bargains. It adored impossible choices. And it especially enjoyed watching humans realize how very small their courage really was. Mila squared her shoulders. Take me. Edric shook his head. No, me. The forest sighed, disappointed. Boring. Lendus, a root lashed out, snaring Edric's ankle. Another coiled around Mila's wrist. They reached for each other as the ground beneath them softened like rotten fruit. The last thing they heard before the earth swallowed them whole was the sound of their own voices, arguing. I said to take me. Obviously, it should be me. You always have to be the hero. And then silence. Dawn crept over the village to find neither lover had returned. The villagers, who had bet heavily on this outcome, began preparing the customary search party with the weary efficiency of people performing a well-rehearsed play. But deep in the forest, something new had taken root. A sapling, slender and pale, sprouted where two sets of footprints had last touched earth. Its leaves, when the wind stirred them, chimed like silver bells. Its bark, when scraped, bled dark and fragrant. And if two travelers ever passed it by moonlight, they might just hear the faint, familiar echo of an argument still unresolved. It was my turn to sacrifice. No, mine. Honestly, you're impossible. The forest, for its part, considered this a happy ending. After all, what was love, if not sharing eternity bickering in the dark? And if the sapling occasionally tripped passing merchants or dumped rainwater on particularly smug priests, well, some traditions were worth preserving. Chapter 11. The Soldier's Last Stand. Captain Vorin had survived 17 years of warfare, 3 assassination attempts, and a particularly nasty bout of swamp fever that had turned his beard an interesting shade of green. He was, in his own professional opinion, unkillable. This made him the perfect candidate to finally deal with the village's ghost problem. A phrase he uttered with the same tone most men reserved for discussing imaginary childhood monsters. You let some trees push you around, he scoffed, sharpening his sword with methodical strokes. The villagers shuffled their feet. The blacksmith opened his mouth to explain. Again that axes melted and priests fled screaming, but Vorin cut him off with a raised hand. Trees don't fight back, you just haven't met the right blade. His strategy was simple, brutal, and entirely human. Scorched earth. He would burn the forest back until whatever lurked inside had nowhere left to hide. The villagers, who had developed a certain resigned pragmatism about these things, watched silently as Vorin assembled his supplies. Oil, torches, and a flint he'd stolen from a temple altar because sacrilege makes fire hotter. They didn't warn him when the oil casks leaked mysteriously overnight, leaving trails that spelled I-D-E-D in jagged letters across the tavern floor. They didn't mention how the torches developed faces in their knots, tiny mouths chewing slowly through the wood. They certainly didn't tell him about the flint, which now whispered battle hymns when left alone in the dark. At dawn, Vorin marched into the forest alone. The first oddity came when his carefully laid oil trails ignited in reverse, the flames racing backward toward their casks instead of forward into the undergrowth. The second came when his sword, freshly sharpened, went blunt after striking a particularly smug-looking birch. The third was the laughter. Not the usual forest giggles, but deep, rolling chuckles that vibrated up through the soil like distant artillery. Show yourselves, Vorin bellowed, pivoting on his heel, blade raised. Face me properly, you cowards. The trees obliged. Not by revealing spirits or monsters, but by doing something far worse. They ignored him. Thorin's torch guttered out despite the lack of wind. His backup flint crumbled to dust. The oil patches dried up as if they'd never been. And still the forest stood, utterly indifferent to his fury. Enraged, Thorin charged the nearest oak, bringing his sword down in a killing arc. Only for the tree to step aside. Not metaphorically. The oak physically lifted its roots and sidestepped the blow with the grace of a dueling master. Thorin's sword buried itself in empty earth. He wrenched it free just in time to see the surrounding trees begin to shift, their trunks twisting as if observing him. A military mind recognizes when tactics must change. Thorin switched to Ziegler's strategy. Find high ground, fortify, wait out the enemy. He scrambled onto a boulder, scattering caltrops around its base, little iron spikes meant to cripple charging horses. The forest responded by growing mushrooms through every spike, soft taps pushing them aside like a hostess clearing away unwanted cutlery. Thorin tried reconnaissance next, climbing a towering pine to survey the land. The higher he climbed, the taller the pine grew, its branches stretching upward like a funhouse mirror's reflection. By the time he reached what should have been the top, the ground was a dizzying distance below, and the pine's crown had tied itself into an elegant knot, trapping him. Dusk found Thorin still-treed, literally and figuratively. His voice had gone hoarse from shouting challenges. His sword arm ached. His pride, however, remained intact. "Fine," he roared at the darkening sky. "You want a proper fight? Send out your champion, single combat, no tricks." The forest went very still. Then, from the shadows, something emerged. It was a squirrel. Not a monstrous squirrel, or a ghostly one. Just an ordinary gray squirrel, its paws clutched around a single acorn. It sat on a branch just beyond Thorin's reach, beady eyes blinking slowly. Thorin stared. "This is a joke." The squirrel dropped the acorn. The nut struck Thorin's forehead with the force of a sling bullet, knocking him backward. He flailed, caught a branch that wasn't there a second ago, and somehow landed hard at the base of the tree. The squirrel chittered. Somewhere, a woodpecker drummed out what sounded suspiciously like a victory fanfare. Defeat was one thing. Humiliation was another. Thorin scrambled to his feet, sword forgotten, and ran. Branches lashed at him as if shooing away a particularly dim puppy. Roots tripped him with the precision of practiced comedians. By the time he burst from the tree line, he was missing one boot. His belt had been neatly replaced by a vine, and his beard had somehow been braided with tiny blue flowers. The villagers found him at the tavern an hour later, drinking directly from a barrel while muttering about ungentlemanly warfare. No one laughed. No one mentioned the faint squirrel tracks in the mud outside. They simply let him drink in peace, occasionally refilling his cup with the resigned air of people who knew the forest always won in the end. And if, years later, travelers occasionally spotted a particularly grizzled squirrel leading raids on unattended picnic baskets with military precision, well, some lessons stick. Chapter 12. The Herbalist's Secret. Old Nan the Herbalist had lived at the forest's edge for 73 years without disappearing, which in the village's estimation made her either the world's foremost expert on spirit avoidance or in league with the things in the trees. The truth, as usual, was more complicated. The villagers came to her cottage in twos and threes, bearing gifts of jam and firewood in hopes of coaxing out her secret. Nan accepted these offerings with the weary patience of someone preparing to disappoint children. She waited until the entire village had gathered in her crooked little garden before speaking. "There is a way," she admitted, stirring a pot of something that smelled like wet dog and defiance. "But you won't like it." The blacksmith leaned forward. "Is it garlic? Holy symbols? Iron nails under the tongue?" Nan snorted. "If iron worked, do you think your idiot brother would still be part of that oak?" She wiped her hands on her apron, which appeared to be made from stitched-together crow feathers. "No, The trick is this. You must be more annoying than the things in the wood. Silence. The miller blinked. That's it? None nodded. Spirits thrive on fear, awe, and the occasional screaming sacrifice. But utter, relentless irritation, they can't abide it. She gestured to her cottage, where dried herbs hung in braids that twitched slightly when no one was looking. I talk to myself constantly. I sing off-key. I leave my garden tools exactly where I last used them, even if that's the middle of a path. Last Tuesday I spent an hour debating the merits of carrot tops versus beet greens with a particularly persistent shadow. By sundown it fled. The villagers exchanged glances. This sounded less like ancient wisdom and more like senility. The baker cleared his throat. So you're saying, if we irritate them enough they'll leave us alone? None cackled. Oh, they won't leave. They'll just avoid you specifically. She tapped the side of her nose. Think of it like mosquitoes. They'll always be around, but they'll bother the juicier targets first. This revelation sparked what historians would later call the village's least heroic rebellion. The blacksmith took up yodeling at odd hours. The miller's wife developed a habit of clicking her tongue rhythmically for hours on end. The children, sensing opportunity, perfected the art of asking endless why questions directed at empty corners. For a time it seemed to work. The forest paths remained clear of shifting shadows. The giggling whispers stayed just beyond earshot. Even the weather improved, as if the spirits couldn't be bothered to arrange proper ominous fog for people who hummed nursery rhymes through their noses. Then came the retaliation. The blacksmith awoke to find every nail in his shop bent at perfect right angles. The miller's wife discovered all her spoons had been welded together into a single useless lump. The children's why questions began being answered, in exhaustive, pedantic detail, by voices from the well. Nan, when confronted about these developments, merely shrugged. I did say they'd avoid you, not that they wouldn't play pranks. She patted the stump she used as a stool, which several villagers swore hadn't been there yesterday. Besides, isn't this better than being eaten? The villagers had to admit it was. And so, an uneasy truce settled over the land. The villagers perfected small, constant annoyances, leaving doors ajar, whistling just slightly flat, developing sudden passionate interests in describing their dreams in excruciating detail. The spirits, in turn, confined themselves to petty revenges, mismatching socks, hiding the good cooking pots, rewriting folk songs to be about the villagers' most embarrassing childhood moments. As for Nan, if you walk past her cottage at twilight, you might see her chatting amiably with a particularly gnarled old birch, sharing a cup of tea that neither of them drinks. The conversations are mostly one-sided, but every so often the birch shakes its leaves in what could be laughter or exasperation. And if some nights the entire forest sighs in unison, long and suffering, as the village's off-key lullabies drift through the trees, well, even spirits have their limits. Chapter 13. The Fool's Luck. Of all the village's mysteries, none provoked more baffled frustration than the case of Bertram the Unconcerned, a man whose mental faculties were, by generous estimation, several chickens short of a full coop. Bertram talked to rocks. He wore his boots on his hands when it rained to keep his fingers warm. He once attempted to milk a bull, because it had the right look about it. And most infuriating of all, he regularly wandered into the old wood to gather mushrooms, hum folk songs to badgers, and somehow return unscathed while better men vanished without a trace. The village had theories, of course. The blacksmith insisted Bertram was secretly a witch. The miller's wife claimed he'd been blessed by a passing saint, though she couldn't explain why a saint would bother. The children whispered that he'd traded his wits to the spirits for protection, a notion that, while plausible, failed to account for how Bertram had anything left to trade. On the morning that broke the village's collective patience, Bertram sauntered back from the tree line with his usual vacant grin, a basket of suspiciously glowing mushrooms. Most outrageously, A new hat. It was a magnificent hat. Felted black wool with silver embroidery that shifted patterns when you blinked. The kind of hat that clearly hadn't been made by human hands, or if it had, not hands that still belonged to their original owner. "Where," demanded the innkeeper, "did you get that?" Bertram beamed. "The nice tree gave it to me." Silence. "The nice tree," repeated the blacksmith. Bertram nodded enthusiastically. "The one with the face. It said I was its best friend, and it wanted me to have a present." He adjusted the hat proudly. "Do you think it matches my eyes?" The villagers stared. The hat did, in fact, perfectly match Bertram's eyes, which was impossible because Bertram's eyes were a watery blue, and the hat's embroidery was currently shimmering through every color of the rainbow before settling on something best described as the shade of a bad idea. Old Thomas, who had been quietly drinking himself into oblivion in the corner, suddenly slammed his tankard down. "That's it! I'm going in after my own damn hat." The villagers managed to stop him, though not before he got one boot off and threw it at Bertram with startling accuracy. Later that night, once Bertram had been safely distracted with a shiny spoon and led away, the village elders convened an emergency meeting. "It's the stupidity," declared the miller. "The spirits can't make sense of him, so they leave him be." The innkeeper shook his head. "No, it's the singing. Last week I heard him belting out a ballad about turnips to a patch of poison ivy." And the herbalist, who had been listening with her usual expression of detached amusement, finally spoke. "You're all wrong. It's because he believes them." This gave the room pause. Bertram talked to trees and expected answers. He complimented shadows on their posture. He thanked rocks for being so rock-like. And most crucially, he never ever doubted that the forest was just as friendly as he was. The blacksmith scowled. "So what? We should all start acting like half-witted children?" Nan shrugged. Worked for Bertram. The meeting dissolved shortly after, though not before the baker pointed out that if they all adopted Bertram's intellect, the village would starve within a week from everyone forgetting how to bake bread. As for Bertram, if you walk the forest paths at dawn, you might spot him holding animated conversations with stumps, leaving little piles of acorns as gifts for particularly shapely roots, or teaching a circle of mushrooms an off-key rendition of the ballad of the one-legged goose. And if the trees seem to lean in closer when he passes, or if the mushrooms pulse in time with his singing, or if the shadows occasionally join in on the chorus, well, even spirits appreciate an audience that doesn't criticize their pitch. As the villagers learned to their ongoing frustration, sometimes the best protection against the supernatural is simply being too delightfully absurd to torment. And if Bertram's new hat sometimes whispers gardening tips to him in his sleep, that's nobody's business but his own. Chapter 14. The Chronicler's Notes. Master Theobald of Winthrop arrived in the village with 3 donkey loads of parchment, 6 quills, and the unshakable conviction that most human problems stemmed from poor record-keeping. He was a historian, a man of letters, and most importantly, a professional skeptic who believed all supernatural phenomena could be explained through proper documentation. Journal entry, day the 1st each eye. Any local superstitions regarding this forest are clearly exaggerated. All evidence suggests a pattern of mundane disappearances compounded by mass hysteria. The so-called whispering trees are likely wind patterns through unusually shaped branches. The giggling is almost certainly a species of nocturnal bird. "I seem to say." Theobald wrote this while seated on a stump at the forest's edge, blissfully unaware that the stump had not been there when he arrived. Journal entry, day the 3rd Shaig. Interviewed the villager called Bertram. Subject exhibits classic signs of congenital idiocy. His claims of friendship with trees are either metaphor or mental deficiency. Note: must investigate whether the local mushrooms contain mind-altering properties. At this point, Theobald's inkwell tipped over without visible cause, spilling black liquid across the page in patterns that vaguely resembled laughing faces. He blamed the uneven ground. Journal entry, day the 5th July. He conducted field observation overnight. No supernatural activity to report, though the behavior of shadows does present some optical curiosity. Several times I observed what appeared to be movement independent of light sources. Must be some variety of phosphorescent insect. Then, Theobald failed to mention how these insects had rearranged his measuring sticks into perfect arrows pointing deeper into the woods. Journal entry, day the 7th July. The villagers' tales grow more absurd with each telling. Today heard a claim that the forest ate a merchant's wagon. Upon examination, found the man in question operating a perfectly normal toy stall. When pressed, locals changed their story to say the forest changed him. Typical folkloric exaggeration. Poison dissuaded. Omnulated secher. He did not record how the toys in said stall occasionally moved on their own, or how one wooden soldier had whispered his name as he passed. Journal entry, day the 9th. Have begun cataloging local flora. Discovered a peculiar variety of mushroom that seems to follow movement. Attempted to collect samples, but the specimens keep. Here the handwriting became abruptly shaky. Disappearing from my satchel. Must be an unusually clever rodent. The next line was scribbled in different ink, as if added later. Unless rodents can untie knots. Journal entry, day the 11th. Decided to venture deeper tomorrow. The only way to disprove these superstitions is through thorough survey. We'll take measurements, document tree formations, and... The entry ended mid-sentence. The villagers found Theobald's camp 3 days later. His notes were neatly stacked, his quills arranged by size. His bedroll lay undisturbed. But the historian himself was gone, leaving behind only his favorite inkwell, now dry, though it had been full the night before, and a single sheet of parchment placed conspicuously atop his journal. It read, in handwriting that was almost but not quite Theobald's, Journal entry, day the 9th. Trees. Fascinating development. It appears the trees do, in fact, whisper. They've been helping me correct my spelling. Also, it turns out the Latin names I've been using for local flora are all wrong. The proper term for the glowing mushrooms is apparently snack. More observations to follow. Istamonin, Idagabanta. The villagers, being practical folk, packed up Theobald's belongings and used his parchment to start a betting pool on how long until he came back. He never did. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the old wood, you can hear the distinct sound of someone lecturing about proper citation methods to an audience of rustling leaves. And if you look very closely at certain trees, you might spot new growths that look suspiciously like bookshelves, their bark swirling into perfect imitations of leather bindings and gilded titles. The spines, should you dare to look, all bear the same name. And the pages, should you ever manage to open one, are completely blank, except for the occasional footnote that wasn't there a second ago. Chapter 15. The Artist's Inspiration. Madame Levna arrived in the village with a trunk full of pigments, a set of brushes made from what she claimed were ethically sourced sable hairs, though the sables in question might have argued, and the unshakable belief that true art required suffering. The forest, with its reputation for swallowing the unwary, struck her as the perfect muse. Horror, she declared to the baffled villagers, is simply beauty that hasn't been properly framed. She set up her easel at the forest's edge at dawn, mixing her paints with the meticulous care of an alchemist brewing poison. The first strokes were tentative, dark greens and browns, the expected tones of any ordinary wood. But as the morning wore on, her palette grew stranger. The blues shimmered with an unnatural iridescence. The reds pulsed like fresh wounds. The black moved. Levna blinked, assuming fatigue. But no. The inky pigment swirled of its own accord, forming shapes at the edge of the canvas that she hadn't painted. A face emerged, then dissolved. A hand reached from the paint, then retreated. Exquisite, she breathed, and dipped her brush again. By noon, the painting had taken on a life of its own. The trees in the image twisted in impossible directions. The shadows pooled in places light should have touched. And the eyes! She hadn't painted any eyes, but they were there nonetheless, peering from between the painted branches. A villager child wandered over, drawn by the colors. He took one look at the canvas and burst into tears. Levna barely noticed. The real forest, meanwhile, watched her work with what might have been amusement. The leaves whispered critiques. More contrast in the northwest corner. And the occasional beetle crawled onto her palette to suggest color corrections. Once, her brush vanished mid-stroke, only to reappear behind her ear, its bristles neatly braided. Levna, lost in her trance, took all this in stride. Genius, after all, often worked in mysterious ways. Night fell. The villagers retreated to their homes, casting uneasy glances at the artist, still laboring by lantern light. Her movements had grown frantic, her strokes jagged. The canvas now depicted a scene far beyond the forest's physical boundaries, a grove of skeletal trees with faces in their bark, a clearing where the shadows stood upright, a figure that might have been Levna herself, her mouth open in what could have been a scream or a song. At some point, the real Levna began to hum along with the whispers. At some point, her paints began replenishing themselves, the colors growing more vibrant than nature allowed. At some point, the eyes on the canvas blinked in unison. Dawn found the villagers gathered around an empty easel. The painting remained, now signed in a hand that wasn't quite Levna's flowing script. The signature curled like a root, the letters subtly wrong. Levna had become Ilvan, with an apostrophe that hadn't been there before. The canvas itself had changed overnight. The scene had deepened, the perspective shifting impossibly to suggest that the viewer was now inside the painting looking out. And at its center, where Levna had been painting the forest, there now stood a new figure, an artist at an easel, her back turned, painting a scene that might have been the very village square in which the villagers now stood. The villagers, being practical folk, sold the painting to a passing nobleman for a modest sum. It hung in his gallery for exactly one night, before the frame was found empty the next morning, the canvas gone. As for Levna, if you walk the forest paths at dusk, you might spot a new tree among the old. Its bark streaked with unnatural colors, its branches twisted like brushstrokes frozen in midair. And if you stand very still, you might hear the faint sound of a brush against canvas, painting something just beyond sight. The nobleman, incidentally, later commissioned a portrait. The artist he hired was young, ambitious, and arrived in the village with a trunk full of suspiciously familiar-looking paints. The villagers didn't warn him. After all, what's one more mad artist in the grand scheme of things? And if the shadows in his paintings sometimes rearrange themselves when no one's looking, well, that's simply the mark of true genius. Chapter 16. The Widow's Lament. The villagers called her Widow Hesta, though she never wore black. She favored dusky greens instead, the color of moss on the north side of trees, of shadows pooling in hollows just before twilight. When asked about her missing husband, she would smile, not the shaky grimace of fresh grief, but the knowing curve of lips that held secrets like honey held sweetness. He always did love that forest, she'd say, stirring her tea with a spoon that had begun to twist like a vine. Her husband, Borin, had been the village's last true woodsman before the spirits grew restless. A quiet man who spoke more to trees than people, who could track a deer by the way ferns trembled hours after its passing. When he didn't return from checking his traps that final morning, no search party was called. The villagers simply nodded, poured an extra ale at the tavern, and waited for Hesta to start wailing. She never did. Instead, she took up mending, not clothes, but oddities. Broken tools with handles that twitched like living things. Cracks in walls that seeped dark liquid. Once, when the miller's wife brought her a shattered mirror, Hesta returned it whole, though reflections now blinked half a second too slow. Did the forest take Boren? Children would whisper, drawn by the smell of her herb cakes, always fresh despite her oven being cold for years. Hesta would pat their heads, her fingers leaving faint trails of pollen no local flower produced. Take implies unwillingness. The rumors spiraled. Some said she'd made a bargain. Others claimed she was something else wearing a widow's skin. Old Tomas swore he'd seen her walking the tree line at midnight, a lantern in one hand and a coil of silver thread in the other, singing a lullaby in a language that made his teeth ache. On the 10th anniversary of Boren's disappearance, the village elders came to her cottage, their courage bolstered by brandy. Enough whispers, the blacksmith demanded. What really happened that day? Hesta served them tea in cups that never emptied. He found what he was looking for. And what was that? The steam from her cup coiled into shapes. A man's face, a crown of antlers, hands that were not quite hands. The heart of it all, she said simply. Later, when the elders stumbled back to the village, their memories fuzzy at the edges, they couldn't recall if she'd meant Boren found the forest's heart, or his own. As seasons passed, Hesta's garden grew strange. Her cabbages pulsed faintly at dusk. Her roses bloomed with petals the texture of skin. The children who dared to peer over her fence swore they saw Boren sometimes, moving between the sun-dappled trees at the far end of the property, though he walked oddly, his limbs bending in too many places, his shadow stretching long after the sun had set. On the day Hesta herself vanished, the villagers found her cottage empty, but for three things. A perfectly made bed with the imprint of two bodies still warm in the sheets. A single boot by the door, its laces tied in an elaborate knot no human fingers could replicate. And on the table, a fresh-baked pie steaming with an aroma that shifted between apple, elderberry, and something no one could name, but that made their mouths water uncontrollably. They buried the boot. Ati, di, pi, tuve. And when new widows came to the village in years to follow, they sometimes reported a woman in green offering comfort from the forest's edge, though none could ever quite recall her face afterward, only the sensation of being truly understood. As for the cottage, if you walk past it on moonless nights, you might see lights in the windows, not the flicker of candles, but the slow, rhythmic pulse of something breathing. And if you listen very carefully, you might hear two voices humming in perfect harmony, just slightly out of phase with this world. The villagers, being practical folk, don't speak of it. After all, some silences are better left unbroken, and some reunions are nobody's business but the forest's. Chapter 17. The Festival of Fools. It began, as most terrible ideas do, with drink. The village had endured years of whispered warnings, disappearances, and unsettling encounters with things that giggled in the dark. The tension had to snap eventually. When the innkeeper, deep into his 7th tankard, declared that the spirits were all bark and no bite, the floodgates opened. "What if we show them we're not afraid?" slurred the blacksmith's apprentice. "Mop them," cried the miller's wife, who had reached that dangerous stage of intoxication where bad ideas sound brilliant. And so the Festival of Fools was born, a night of deliberate irreverence designed to prove the village wouldn't be cowed. They would dress as spirits, parody their whispers, turn the forest's terrors into comedy. What could possibly go wrong? Preparations began with alarming enthusiasm. Children fashioned crude masks from bark and berries. The baker created spirit bread shaped like screaming faces, which sold out immediately. Old Thomas, the only sober voice of reason, took one look at the burgeoning madness and announced he would be spending the evening anywhere else. As dusk fell, The villagers gathered at the forest's edge in costumes that ranged from unsettling to outright offensive. The blacksmith wore antlers made of rusted nails, clanking ominously with each step. The miller's wife had draped herself in moss and chicken bones, cackling in a poor imitation of the forest's whispers. Someone had even constructed a crude effigy of the whispering tree, a sapling wrapped in stolen pages from Theobald's abandoned notes. The innkeeper, now leading the procession with a jug of something potent in each hand, raised his voice. "Spirits, we don't fear you." The forest exhaled. For a moment, nothing happened. The villagers' laughter grew louder, bolder. The miller's wife snatched the effigy and began dancing with it, her mocking song echoing between the trees. Then the effigy blinked. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, a flicker of movement in the knot-hole eyes. The miller's wife stumbled mid-step, her drunken grin faltering. The villagers fell silent, their jeers dying in their throats. A breeze rustled through the clearing. Not the usual whispering wind, but something slower, more deliberate, the sound of someone flipping through pages. The stolen notes on the effigy's limbs shimmered, their words rearranging before their eyes. Theobald's precise handwriting melted into jagged, unfamiliar script that spelled out a single phrase. "Shu called." Then the festival truly began. The antlers on the blacksmith's head twisted, digging into his scalp like living things. The baker's spirit bread pulsed in its baskets, the screaming faces now chewing their way free of the crust. The miller's wife shrieked as her costume of moss and bones took root, twining around her limbs like affectionate vines. From the trees, laughter erupted. Not the usual eerie whispers, but full-throated, belly-deep amusement. Shadows peeled away from trunks, forming crude imitations of the villagers' own ridiculous costumes. A figure made of rusted nails and leaves mimicked the blacksmith's stumbling gait. A thing woven from parchment and thorns curtsied mockingly at the miller's wife. The innkeeper, suddenly sober, dropped his jugs. Oh. The forest had decided to play along. What followed was neither tragedy nor horror, but something far worse. Humiliation. The villagers' mockery was turned back on them with perfect, brutal precision. Every jeer was echoed tenfold. Every mocking dance was replicated by something with too many joints. Their own foolish words were thrown back in voices that shifted between theirs and something else entirely. By midnight, the villagers had fled, their costumes alive and pursuing them. The blacksmith arrived home with his antlers, now permanently fused to his scalp. The miller's wife spent a week picking berries from her hair where the moss had taken root. The baker's bread had to be barricaded in the cellar, where it still sobbed at irregular intervals. As for the effigy, it stood for years at the forest's edge, its pages shifting daily to document village gossip in painfully accurate detail. Children dared each other to touch it, though none ever did twice, not after seeing their deepest secrets spelled out in ink that hadn't been there the day before. The Festival of Fools became an unspoken taboo, not out of fear, but sheer embarrassment. After all, there's no terror quite like being laughed at by something that does it better than you. And if, on certain nights, the trees still rustle with the echoes of that laughter, well, some lessons only need teaching once. Chapter 18. The Final Witness. Of all the villagers, only Fenwick the Goatherd could claim to have seen the spirits and lived, which was unfortunate, because Fenwick was also the worst possible witness. He stumbled back into the village at dawn on the third day of his disappearance, his clothes inside out, his beard braided with living ivy, and his eyes wide with the particular madness that comes from seeing too much and understanding none of it. The villagers found him sitting by the well, calmly drinking from a boot he insisted was a teacup. "Tell us what happened," demanded the blacksmith, shaking Fenwick by the shoulders. Fenwick blinked slowly. "They threw a party." Silence. "Ah, party," repeated the miller. Fenwick nodded, flicking a beetle from his sleeve that hadn't been there a moment before. "For the trees. It was the elder oak's birthday. or possibly its funeral. The invitations were a bit vague. The villagers exchanged glances. The blacksmith tried again. "What did you see?" What followed was the least helpful account in the village's history, a rambling, disjointed tale that made Bertram sound like a scholar by comparison. There had been lights, Fenwick said, but not fire. Music, but no instruments. Dancing, but the dancers had too many joints or not enough. The trees had worn hats. The shadows had brought gifts. At some point, someone had served cake that changed flavor depending on who was eating it. The mushroom tart, Fenwick whispered conspiratorially, tasted like all my worst memories. The blacksmith pinched the bridge of his nose. Did they say anything about why they take people? Fenwick considered this. They're lonely. Another pause. And bored, he added. Mostly bored. The villagers waited for more, but Fenwick had lapsed into silence, picking at the ivy in his beard, which seemed to be sprouting tiny white flowers. When pressed, he would only add one final detail. They're watching us right now. This, predictably, caused a panic. The villagers scanned the trees, the shadows, even their own homes for signs of unseen observers. The baker swore his rolling pin had blinked. The miller's wife found her reflection winking at her from a rain barrel. But as days passed and nothing happened, the urgency faded. Fenwick's story was dismissed as the ravings of a man who had eaten too many questionable mushrooms. The ivy in his beard eventually fell out, though it took root near the well and grew abnormally fast. His boot teacup was confiscated and burned, it screamed. Life returned to its uneasy normal. Yet sometimes, when the wind blew just right, villagers would catch snippets of distant music. Children reported receiving tiny, crudely wrapped gifts left on their windowsills. A smooth stone that whispered when held to the ear, a bundle of twigs tied with spider silk that never came undone. And Fenwick? He took to leaving offerings at the forest's edge, a cup of milk, a handful of berries, once a particularly nice hat. These always vanished by morning, though once the villagers swore they saw the hat perched on a distant branch, sized for something much larger than a man. The villagers, being practical folk, chose not to dwell on these things. After all, it's easier to dismiss one madman than to admit the world is stranger than you thought. And if the trees sometimes hum along with the village's songs, or if the shadows occasionally dance when no one's looking, well, that's just the wind. Probably. Chapter 19. The Forest's Gift. On the first day of spring, a basket appeared at the edge of the village. It was woven from living vines, still supple and green despite the season, and filled with blackberries so plump they glistened like polished onyx. A note rested atop them, written in jagged script that bled slightly into the paper. Be for the little ones. Mind the thorns. Shine in policy. The villagers stared. The children, being less burdened by common sense, reached immediately for the berries. Wait. The blacksmith grabbed his son's wrist. They could be poisoned, or cursed, or... His words died as the boy popped one into his mouth. The village held its collective breath. The child's eyes widened. It tastes like Grandma's pie. More children followed suit. Soon the basket was empty, though no one could recall seeing the last berry being eaten. The vines withered to dust moments later, leaving behind only the note, which, when examined, now read, "You're welcome. Is it Lament?" This proved to be the first of many gifts. The next week brought a bundle of firewood that burned without smoke, its flames flickering green and blue while emitting the scent of baking bread. The week after that, a cluster of mushrooms appeared near the well, fragrant, golden-capped things that made any soup they touched taste like the cook's fondest memory. The villagers, being practical folk, accepted these offerings with wary gratitude. They ate the mushrooms after having Bertram sample them first. They burned the strange wood, though they drew lots to see who would tend the fire. And when a perfectly stitched cloak appeared one morning, sized for the miller's ailing mother, they pretended not to notice how the embroidery shifted patterns when no one was looking. Only old Tomas voiced what others dared not ask. Why now, after all these years of taking? The answer came on Midsummer's Eve. The village awoke to find every doorstep bearing a small token, a carved wooden figure resembling their missing loved ones. Havelock's family received a tiny shepherd with removable wool. Gregor's wife found a wooden axe that somehow balanced perfectly on its head. The scholar's figure clutched a book whose pages could be turned, each leaf thinner than a fingernail yet covered in minuscule writing. Most unsettling of all, the figures moved when placed in sunlight. Not much, just a twitch of the hand or tilt of the head, as if caught mid-gesture. Fenwick, who had taken to napping in sunny patches like a cat, was the first to notice the real miracle. "They're happy," he murmured, squinting at the tiny wooden Gregor balancing on his knee. The villagers scoffed, until the miller's daughter placed her mother's figure in a beam of light and swore she saw it smile. That night, whispers drifted from the forest, familiar voices woven into the usual rustling leaves. The blacksmith heard his brother's booming laugh. The baker caught a snippet of his wife's favorite lullaby. Even the skeptical village elders had to admit the wind carried fragments of conversations long silenced. By dawn, the wooden figures were gone from their shelves and windowsills. In their place, curled like sleeping cats in patches of sunlight, the villagers found single leaves, each bearing a single word in delicate veinwork. Content. Appearanceantisit. Enjoy. Tutkuun. And dadidi. Homasi. The villagers, being practical folk, didn't speak of these things. But the next time a child wandered too close to the tree line, no one ran screaming after them. When the miller's best apron went missing, she simply shrugged and said, "They'll return it better." And on stormy nights, when the wind howled just so, some claimed to hear not screams, but laughter, the kind that comes from being exactly where one belongs. As for the spirits, if you walk past the old wood at twilight, you might see them, shapes flitting between the trees, no longer hiding. Some wear familiar faces. Some don't wear faces at all. But all of them, every last one, move with the easy grace of creatures who are exactly where they want to be. And if that thought sends a shiver down your spine, well, perhaps you're just not ready for your gift yet. Chapter 20. The Listener's Choice. The villagers have told you their stories. The missing, the mad, the inexplicably returned. You've heard of mushrooms that whisper, trees that dance, and shadows with a wicked sense of humor. Now, as the fire burns low and the night stretches thin, there is only one question left. Would you enter the forest? Be honest. You've already considered it. There's something about forbidden places that hums in human bones. The same impulse that makes children poke dead things with sticks, that sends men marching into storms just to say they did. You tell yourself you'd be different, of course. Smarter. More cautious. You wouldn't whistle a nervous tune as shadows pulled at your feet. You wouldn't jump at the snap of a twig that wasn't there before. And when the first giggle drifted from the branches, high and bright and just a little too close, you certainly wouldn't run. Would you? The villagers could warn you about the way the paths twist. They could describe how the air thickens between one step and the next, how the scent of damp earth rises like an exhale, how the trees lean in to listen. They might even mention the gifts left for those who don't fight the inevitable, the crowns of ivy that fit a little too perfectly, the cups of wine that taste like childhood summers, the hands, or what pass for hands, that beckon with unsettling grace. But none of it would matter, because you're already standing at the edge, aren't you? The villagers' voices fading behind you, your pulse loud in your ears. The first step is always the easiest. The forest doesn't rush. It has all the time in the world, and it knows, with quiet certainty, that every living thing comes to the woods eventually. Maybe you'll be the exception. Maybe you'll walk back to the fire, to the light, to the safe and sensible world where trees are just trees. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll take another step, and then another. And then, well, we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? The fire crackles. The village's eyes gleam in the dark. Somewhere beyond the circle of light, a branch creaks, not from wind, from weight. Still here? Interesting. But don't worry, we won't tell.